Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Global meat consumption is predicted to increase by 50% by 2050. It's widely agreed that innovation is needed, as current global production practices are unsustainable at this forecast level of future demand. It's also widely agreed that asking people to eat less meat simply won't work. And no one doubts that these are complex challenges. Today I'm joined by Bruce Friedrich, founder of the Good Food Institute and author of the recent book Meat, to explore the all-of-the-above approach to addressing global meat demand. Bruce, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Ash. It's my pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
You have devoted much of your career, and including the founding of the Good Food Institute and the recent book that you wrote called Meat, to alternative proteins, and as a way of limiting the damage that our food production, especially agricultural animal production systems, have on the environment and the climate. Do you want to talk us through the journey to get to where you are today?
So I'll attempt to do the abbreviated version, and just say that in high school and college, I became very concerned about global hunger, and basically decided that's what I wanted to focus my life on. In college, I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet that I'm sure most of your listeners will be familiar with. It basically makes the point that in a global agricultural system, inefficiency matters a lot, and that growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals is inefficient, has a lot of environmental harms, drives up food prices, and leads to hunger and malnutrition. So I ran a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen for about 6 years in inner city Washington, D.C. When I was there, I read a book called Christianity and the Rights of Animals by an Anglican theologian and professor of theology at Oxford named Andrew Lindsay. That book caused me to radically transform how I thought about the animal-human relationship. I went and worked at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals for quite a while, at Farm Sanctuary for a bit, running their policy work. So mostly working on improving farm animal treatment and farm animal slaughter, both those things. And then about 11 years ago, I was inspired by Pat Brown, Ethan Brown, who would talk about the idea that alternative proteins could basically serve, with regard to meat's external costs, the same role that renewable energy serves and electric vehicles serve with regard to the external costs, the climate, predominantly impact of fossil fuel production. And I was really inspired by one of the things Ethan says pretty consistently, which is that meat is made up of lipids, amino acids, minerals, and water. We should be able to use science and engineering to create something that is identical from a sensory standpoint. And because it's more efficient, we should be able to make it cost less. So that's sort of half of the thing that meat is about and that we're focused on. And then the other half is cultivated meat. So just like you can take a seed or a cutting from a plant and grow a whole plant, you can take a small amount of animal muscle or animal fat and grow borderline unlimited additional animal muscle and animal fat. And both of these processes, because they're so much more efficient, they will have significant benefits from a land use perspective, from a climate perspective, things like antimicrobial resistance, pandemic risk, water use and pollution and so on. Um, and it will end up being the product that consumers love, the meat that consumers love, but at a lower price as it scales up, is the hypothesis and the goal. And all of this is based in a recognition that every year that the UN Food and Agriculture Organization has been measuring, um, farmed animal production has gone up. If you look exclusively at land animal production, there have been, three very small ticks down. One for bovine spongiform encephalopathy, for mad cow disease. One for African swine fever and COVID, sort of a double downtick in 2019 and 2020. But by the next year, the upward trajectory just kept going. And all analysis that exists indicates that the world is going to eat at least 50% more meat by 2050. Meat production is just going to keep going up, which means the external costs are going to keep going up, almost certainly. And so this is a way to give people the meat that they love, but produced in a way that doesn't require so much land and have the other external costs. That as a concept really resonated with me. And so I started GFI, the Good Food Institute, about 11 years ago.
So all the things that you mentioned in terms of the planet, the climate, food production, meat production, you're no spring chicken. You're probably a similar kind of vintage to myself. Um, humanity, we as humans have known about this for decades. And then if we even go back into the climate, it was over 100 years ago that, people first realized that carbon dioxide and methane had warming effects and retained heat. So as a species, why do you think when there have been so many warnings for a long, long time that the warming and the events that are happening today, what's been happening in Europe and elsewhere in the world, are likely to occur? Why do you think that as a species we haven't been able to actually change our practices or our trajectory to avoid, you know, such a expected risk that we're facing now?
Yeah, I mean it's certainly intriguing. I mean the observation is super clear. So alternative proteins, we often frame it in terms of things like electric vehicles and renewable energy. Um, so energy consumption just continues to go up. It's been going up since forever. I think there was a small blip for COVID, but just like meat production, it just picked right back up as though it had never dropped. Number of miles driven, number of cars on the road just keep going up. Um, and I think human beings just our programming doesn't allow us, like as a species, um, to consume less. Like small is beautiful. I think it's a powerful concept, but globally, even in developed economies, people continue to consume more miles, more cars, more energy consumption like that. It has been inexorable. Um, and it's similarly true for meat, that meat consumption just keeps going up. There are a couple of European countries where that has not been true, but those European countries have just been completely swamped by increased meat consumption everywhere else. And of course, this is complex. This is made more complex by equity issues. Developing economies for from a like energy consumption perspective, it's not it's energy consumption is associated with wealth. It's associated with productivity. It's associated with like better lives. It's really important that developing economies consume more energy for the well-being of the people in those countries. There's a similar argument that can be made about meat. It is incredibly dense, nutritional, calories, both the macronutrients and the micronutrients, the protein digestibility, et cetera. So people will often, when they're talking about this issue, well, they will say, People in developed economies need to eat less meat. People in developing economies need to eat more meat. Um, and fair enough, except that people in developed economies are not going to eat less meat. They're not eating less meat. They're not going to suddenly eat less meat. You mentioned that we've known about global warming for more than 100 years. I mean, we've really been super focused on it since people have really, the congressional testimony from James Hansen, I think it was like 1985 or 86, something like that. So it's really, it's been a real priority for a lot of people for, since then, at least. Diet for a Small Planet. I think the cover says the book that revolutionized the way America eats, maybe something like that. That's, I think, 52, 53 years old at this point. And in both cases, energy consumption, fossil fuel consumption, meat consumption has just skyrocketed and continues to skyrocket. So it's extraordinarily complex. And I think the like most important question is what do we do about it? And I think we need an all of the above strategy in both cases. So if you're looking at climate, we need walkable cities, we need bike friendly cities, we need great public transit, we need more energy efficient everything. And I think on the meat and animal production side, we need the animal products that we produce. We need to figure out how to lower emissions, increase productivity, basically reduce harm. And then we can also, and we should also, figure out how to make meat from plants, cultivate actual animal meat directly, in the same way that we need certainly wind and solar. I think also nuclear. I think we need an all of the above strategy to deal with the problem. But I don't know precisely why humanity has struggled so much to deal with the problem, other than to say that we are still a biological species that really struggles with anything that looks like self-denial. So consuming more, driving more, people feel that their quality of life improves with those things. And certainly in developing economies, that's 100% true. In developed economies, you can argue about it, but it's not a particularly useful argument or conversation. You're not going to convince people. Obviously, we've been trying for a really long time, or at least you're not going to convince enough people. You'll convince some people. And I think the same thing is true about meat. I mean, this is the point of chapter 5 of the book. Well, it might be biological, physiological, it might be emotional, it might be cultural. But people have since time immemorial consumed kind of as much meat as they can afford. Not exactly. That's slightly hyperbolic, but not by a lot.
It's fascinating when you think about all this because firstly, I agree completely both on the energy and the food side of things that the yes, all of the above, given expectations or predictions in population rise and then it doesn't at all help having conflict thrown into the mix and disrupting fertilizer flows and energy flows and all those sorts of things and frequently it's the most vulnerable on the planet that are the ones who suffer the most from those kind of events as well.
Yeah.
um, but I guess on that note, there's a lot of, I guess, tribalism is possibly the way of putting it between whether you're for meat or whether you're for alternative proteins or dietary changes or however you want to put that. And frequently the people who where the tribalism exists are people who you may think would be natural allies. Um, there's a lot of things these groups of people have in common, but they seem to become very tribal and start taking on each other rather than the bigger problems. How have you experienced that phenomenon, and do you think that's changing in any way, either getting stronger or dissipating as we go forward?
Yeah. I mean, on this point, I often think about The Life of Brian. Do you know that movie?
Yeah, yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah. And it's like, we're the People's Revolutionary Front. or the Revolutionary
The
Front of Judea.
Popular People's
We're
Front of the GD, or in the Judean Popular People's Front, and all those sorts of things.
yeah, and it's I mean, I think it's very odd the degree to which there's kind of the chastising of the heretic. So you end up with the people who are closest to you as the people who you're like most offended and upset that they don't see things in precisely the same way that you do. So I think there's some of that going on. It's the precise tribalism that you just described. If somebody's in an entirely other tribe, somehow we might have even more like compassion or more openness to having conversations and working together, et cetera, than we are people who are ostensibly in our tribe, but don't see things in quite the same way. And I think that, I mean, I think this is the story of kind of every movement since forever, as encapsulated by the life of Brian. So I think that's part of it. And then I think there's also a lot of people really see things as zero sum games. And so in a world where resources are tight, you'll have people working on the same thing, and everybody is labor constrained, talent constrained. Everybody is resource constrained, and so oftentimes people um, will, and I think generally speaking, it ends up being sort of circular firing squad. But I think what drives it is a sense of like incredible passion that people have for the work that they're doing. And then in the first case, how come you can't see that this is the most important work? Which I think is oftentimes motivated reasoning. And then in the second case, a sort of, desperation to do the most good possible in the world, and a sense that with limited resources and limited talent, you're kind of against the people who are working on the same thing, because people see their profit as our loss kind of thing. And I agree that it's extraordinarily unfortunate, and that ideally we would all be allies.
The alternative protein space, go back 4 or 5 years from now, and there was a lot of VC funding, the Impossible and Beyond Beef and many others, and the it was introduced to restaurants, it was introduced in grocery stores, a much bigger presence in the US than elsewhere in the world, but not exclusively in the United States. And a lot of those companies are really struggling. Many have closed down, they had to shut their doors. Others are not, obviously it's the VC space, and how many companies actually do achieve the growth that they predict. So let's just park that part of the conversation for the moment. But a lot of them are struggling to create the revenue and the demand and sales that they need. Where do you see that? Is that something that you always thought would happen because the innovation does come in waves? Or what's your, I guess, analysis of that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I was recently on a podcast that I was last on in 2020, and so I went back and listened to what I was saying in 2020, and then I looked back a little further and listened to some podcasts from 2019 to just see whether I was misremembering what I was saying, and just to sort of check my memory against reality. And indeed, what I was saying in 2019 and 2020, so even just before the sort of massive uptick in VC funding, before Beyond Meat's massive IPO, et cetera, and what I was saying, and I still think it's true, is that this is not an app. This is not AI or some tech stack. This is producing stuff. And producing stuff is really, really hard. And agriculture is really, really hard. And so starting in, I have a TED talk from, I think, April 2019. And the entire point of the talk is governments need to recognize the value of alternative proteins to things that governments care about. and governments should be incentivizing alternative proteins in the same way that they incentivize R&D, manufacturing, scale up for other technologies that are important. Certainly things like electric vehicles and renewable energy, also things like biopharma, conventional agriculture, technology, et cetera. And like one of my lines to Ezra Klein was, without that, we're going to have very few products, and it's going to take an incredibly long time to get to success. So, I mean, that's sort of the Uber observation is scale up in particular is hard. The theory of change has always been and still is that the products are going to need to compete on price and taste before they're going to reach any kind of reasonable market adoption and consequently significant mission impact, significant profit. And that's, that is going to take time and it's going to take resources. So not surprising that plant-based products that do not yet compete on price and taste, especially, the best products are nowhere near competing on price. And then cultivated meat, even the price differential is even greater. And then I think with plant-based meat, and I talk about this in the book, I think the vast majority of the companies that came along to take advantage of the VC enthusiasm were Garden Burger clones or Garden Burger followers, not Impossible and Beyond followers. So, you look at a company like Impossible, and Pat Brown is like one of the most brilliant scientists on the planet. And it still took him at least tens of millions of dollars and 5 years to get to the Impossible Burger. Beyond Meat, their sort of signature product, the Beyond Burger, came, I think Ethan started working on it in 2009, so 7 years after he started working on it. But even their first product was the product of significant R&D out of the University of Missouri, and I think took 3 or 4 years before they launched it. And he ended up pulling it because it wasn't good enough, the chicken product. So not surprising, I think, where we are. Although obviously would prefer to be in a world where money was continuing to flow in. I will say, I mean, from a convince governments that this is important to things that governments care about. The other thing I noticed from the podcast I did in July of 2020 was that I, said to Simon Hill, the podcaster, that GFI's number 1, 2, and 3 goal was government support for these technologies. And he asked, well, how's that going? And my response was, we're optimistic. But there wasn't any yet. Singapore and Israel were doing some incentives for private industry, for startups. But governments actually, what we need is plant-based meat and cultivated meat that are commodity products, not plant-based and cultivated meat where the IP is owned by one company. And that's going to require that governments fund research into the key challenges in ways that everybody can take advantage of the findings. And even as recently as 6 years ago, right now, there was none of that. It started a little bit, just a little bit later. There was the National Science Foundation grant, and then some other countries started funding. But 6 years ago, right now, it was zero. And now it's, tens of millions of dollars a year, maybe north of $100 million a year going into R&D. So we're at least moving in the right direction.
I think if you look at the electric vehicle space and China and what they've done in that space, and once again, there's a whole lot of nuance. There's, the accusations of stealing IP. I don't know the space well enough to know what has been created and what has been stolen. But I know that, there's China has a history of doing that. But when they prioritize something like what they prioritized in electric vehicles, China is an example of how quickly that can move and how much progress can be made. I guess firstly, is China taking on, because obviously they've got a huge population. They got their swine population was absolutely decimated by the African swine fever outbreak. What's that, 6 or 7 years ago? And are they throwing resources at this? And if so, is there the risk that, this is another area where the West loses its strategic advantage?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also not an expert on IP and China, but I will say, I mean, one thing that happened that's true is that Elon Musk had a very sort of open source attitude toward Tesla, with a view toward the idea, which I think was right, that he wasn't trying to create one car company. He was trying to create an industry, and if he had to do it all by himself, that was going to be a lot harder than if he had a bunch of other people who were also enthusiastic about it. He rightly saw competition as valuable. And, he is Elon Musk, so he thought he would win in the end. Um, he also obviously took Tesla to China in a really big way. So I think it's entirely possible that Elon's open source attitude and understanding of what China can do vis-a-vis production is why BYD is now, I think, bigger than Tesla. It's certainly selling more cars. And China is just like got such a production sort of hold there. I would really like to see the plant-based and cultivated meat industries have a similar recognition that, to the degree possible, sharing IP and like open sourcing the IP is going to help to create an industry which will have a lot of allies, and that will be good for the entire sector, including the individual companies. And mostly that's happening. I mean, it's really impressive to see people like Mark Post at Mosa Meat, and the folk, other people in the sector publishing lots and lots of their results that they could keep much closer to their chest. Avow Foods sharing their breakthrough in terms of production and cultivator design, et cetera. So that's, I think, really good to see. To your specific question, yes, China. China's pretty opaque. It's hard to figure out exactly what's happening. But you can look at patents as one example of the 20 most active patent holders over the last 5 or 6 years. 8 of them are in China. So it's crushing. South Korea and the U.S. and Israel each have three of the most active patent holders, but China has almost as much as 2, 3, and 4 combined. And the reason for that is straight food security, food self-sufficiency. When China joined the WTO in the early 2000s, they were a net exporter of food. And because China is eating more and more and more meat, they're just importing overwhelming amounts of feed crops. And they're also the number one importer of, I think, every species of meat. And that's requiring massive amounts of land, massive amounts of feed crops, et cetera. And their land productivity, it doesn't seem, at least it's not going up tremendously, which means the more meat they consume, other than seafood, the more meat they consume, the more they're going to have to import feed crops and import the actual meat. So China sees that as a problem, sees food technology, and including plant-based and cultivated meat as part of the solution, and they are leaning in, and that's one of the things that allows alternative proteins to be bipartisan in the U.S. Is not wanting, nobody wants, Democrat or Republican, nobody wants China to own global food. That's going to be bad for the U.S. in the same way that China owning the all of the production infrastructure for solar EVs and wind energy. And imagine if, like, so now we have a situation where, as you know, China is exporting sustainable energy production into developing economies as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Imagine China suddenly, is doing that with protein production, which is at least as important to developing economies as energy infrastructure. China's sort of hold on global food, global agriculture could really be something that I think should be and will be concerning about certainly people in the United States across the political spectrum, also, Europe and other developed economies.
It's once again back to the things that we should have seen 20, 30 years ago, why are we only just, when they're right in front of our face, why are they only just becoming visible now? What I think 2009 or 2010, I spent some time in, I was actually in Cameroon. I was in a village way up in the northern part of Cameroon. There was wasn't quite a famine, but there was a malnutrition crisis there. I was there with UNICEF. And every single town or reasonable sized town or city, every hospital had this team of Chinese people there. There was two doctors, two nurses, a driver, and a cook, and they sent these teams, thousands and thousands of them, all across Africa to help the local communities with medical services. So they've been laying the groundwork for that engagement through a soft power sort of play for decades now.
Yeah, I mean, and it's hard to begrudge them at that, right? Like, it's sort of like, if you look at it, like, it's a good thing to get medical care in developing economies. It's a good thing to have infrastructure, roads, airports, um, economic development. Ideally, you would see developed economies recognizing that that is a part of what we should be doing. And even outside the realm of calling it soft power, although it is, it's also just like an inherently good thing for people to do if you have the sort of wealth that developed economies, and in particular the United States have, to create better development everywhere. Obviously, it also increases, it has utilitarian positive effects, obviously, but it also is just like an inherent, a thing that people who purport to be a Judeo-Christian nation, like it's just the values of that we should be embracing, I think.
Oh, completely. And back to this hospital that I spent some time in, visiting. That that they were the doctors and the medical services of choice for the local population because they had better training and qualifications than, and they'd also be knowledge transfer and teaching and all that sort of stuff as well with what they did. So they made a real had a real positive impact on from the health side of things on those communities.
It'd
Um,
be nice. I mean, it'd be nice if like, everybody in the US looked at that and said, "Oh gosh, we should do that too." Um, because it's the right thing to do, really. But like the Human Genome Project, I have a part in the book where I talk about, I've traditionally, my line has been, we need a Manhattan Project for alternative proteins, but I think we need a Human Genome Project for alternative proteins, and that included the Human Genome Project, included China. I think the challenges that we're up against are sufficient that ideally, it would involve working together to solve those challenges. Would love to see the world working together to solve hunger and malnutrition and health scourges. Imagine that village in Cameroon if there were American doctors and Japanese doctors and Chinese doctors. And imagine that across sub-Saharan Africa, across any place where they have significant death losses and other lost productivity due to health scourges that are easily solvable. Like that would like we could afford to do it. We could afford to wipe out hunger and malnutrition. We should. And I think similarly, we could and should address the range of issues. And I think something like a human genome project focused on plant-based meat and cultivated meat would be really beautiful and make a lot of sense.
Was one other thing about that village in northern Cameroon and the doctors there, the medical stuff. It was, and this is where the Chinese approach differed a lot to the Western development approaches. The people who went there were there for years. It wasn't someone who just went there for a couple of months or on short rotations and then went back. They actually got to know the local cultures and the local communities and all that sort of stuff, so that so that time frame makes a difference. Um,
Yeah, that's really, yeah. I mean, that's really beautiful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and there has been literally probably tens of thousands of them across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa over recent decades. Um, back to the US, and a lot of ranchers, meat producers, whether it's poultry or swine or beef, see alternative proteins as the competition. They see them as undermining their markets. And I had a very interesting conversation with Jack Bobo from UCLA on the podcast a year or so ago. And he pointed out that when you looked at this from that rancher perspective, if the current situation went on and supply of beef, actual, cow-grown beef and demand continued on the trajectory, prices wouldn't dramatically change. Whereas if alternative protein came in and made the supply of beef stayed the same, but the demand would go up, that would turn animal grown beef as into more and more of a luxury product and likely drive the price up of beef. So that ranchers would actually be making more money um, if that supply demand equation was more in their favor for a luxury product. And that he's the only person I've ever spoken to who's mentioned looking at it through that lens. So I guess, do you think alternative proteins are a threat to beef production or beef producers and and swine producers' livelihoods? And if you do not think they're a threat, then what can be done to alleviate that sort of fears that their markets are being undermined?
Yeah, I mean those are I mean this goes back to your sort of natural allies question, I think. And as you know, in the book, I point out that it's certainly true that ranchers and beef producers, at least to some degree, look at alternative proteins as a threat, and I think dairy farmers as well. Um, I'm not sure about poultry and pig producers because those have become so vertically integrated that most of the jobs in those areas, I think, can just transfer into plant-based and cultivated meat. The exception to that would be agroecology, which we can, or regenerative practices, but that's such a small percentage of chicken and pig production. And I think those should also absolutely be our natural allies. Um, but with regard to ranchers, one of the things I point out in the book is that, since Earl Butz was Secretary of Agriculture in the early 1970s, there's been this sort of get big or get out ethos across agriculture. And because alternative proteins free up land and free up resources, this should be something where producers and especially ranchers, um, not just because it will allow prices to go up and you can make more money from even the exact same production practices, um, but with freeing up land that decreases prices for land, it allows for more regenerative grazing and other regenerative processes that will allow prices to go up. And then ideally, if we can, and this is not self-executing, but if we can complement the policies, agricultural policies, with restoration, rewilding, and these nature-based sequestrations, biodiversity preservation, et cetera, that becomes easier in a world where less land is required to create the same amount of beef, poultry, pork, et cetera. So GFI commissioned a report in the UK that from a sustainability think tank in the UK, Green Alliance, and they modeled alternative protein production, and with the freed up land across 10 European countries, what they found was that 8 of those countries could become food self-sufficient, and the other 2 countries would be food self-sufficiency as a part of the whole, food self-sufficient as a part of the whole. If a third of the land were dedicated to producing internally, they could become food self-sufficient, and agricultural prices would go up because people were shifting to producing for human beings. With a third of the land, they shifted to agroecology, regenerative practices, and that could go up by 400%. Not up by 400%, but up by 4x. So up by 300,
Yep.
4 times as much. And then with a third of the land, if it went to rewilding, they could sequester. This is in the book. I think it was like 260 million metric tons of carbon, and move toward meeting biodiversity targets that the European Union had committed toward. I think it gets you like 80% of the way there. That last one is not self-executing at all. And that's one where I think it could be a supplemental income for ranchers and farmers. But you need policies that center on ranchers and farmers. We don't have the policies now that are prioritizing making farming and ranching something that people want, young people want to do, multi-generational. And so farmers and ranchers are leaving the farm, leaving the ranch, even as number of animals and amount of meat produced goes up, and even as profitability goes down. So I do think alternative protein production could be a big part of solving a lot of what ails farming and ranching now, and could really open up some opportunities for alliances that might feel a little counterintuitive, but that I think make a ton of sense.
A lot of what you say there hinges on government policy to drive whatever necessary changes across the different societies and economies. Do you think there's a path that this can be moved forward on without the required government policies to drive it in that direction? Or is that a very big uphill battle?
Well, I mean, I think what Jack is talking about doesn't require government policy. I think a lot of some of the sort of just how markets work. Um, if you even just look at, I think Jack was talking about this. If you even just look at the increase in production that's going to be required, and alternative proteins to fill that increase, that part would not require government support. But I think a lot of what I was talking about would either require carbon markets, which I'm not super optimistic about, but a lot of people are. So I think carbon markets could solve it without government policy, or it's going to require government policy. And then we're back to your sort of point from earlier about we watch CO2 and methane levels rise and rise and rise. And you could add things like forests being chopped down, biodiversity loss, water drying up, aquifers drying up. Like there's a lot, on the one hand, I have been hearing for 40 years the idea that we're going to hit an ecological crisis and governments are going to have to wake up. And so for 40 years, environmentalists have been claiming that, as well as things like population bomb and the Ehrlichs, and sort of there will be a crisis and it will prompt government policy to help solve the problem. And at least so far, hasn't happened. But it does feel, I mean, it does feel the last 5 or 10 years different, in terms of especially water resources, and just crazy weather. So I could imagine governments sort of forced to finally recognize that we need to be taking this as seriously as we took something like acid rain. Um, but yeah, if they don't, it's going to be a much steeper climb for sure. And
I
and I
think
guess the last thing I'll say is it's going to be a lot harder if we're fighting one another. Having actual like figuring out some policy alliances um, that look a little counterintuitive, and using those policy alliances to actually petition the people who could make these changes happen.
yes, yes. Moving on to the global south. because that's where 80% of livestock emissions, methane, come from non-OECD countries, and that's where the greatest population growth is going on. That's where the greatest increase in meat consumption is happening, and this is meat consumption from very, very low levels, but also from the health and nutrition and welfare side of those countries. The fact that they're getting better quality, higher quality diets, higher protein diets has a huge, huge positive effect. How do you see the challenges there? And I think especially in line with, the global south has had so much, I guess, colonialism slash neo-colonialism from the global north, and don't really just want to be told or won't be told that, oh, this is what happens in Europe, in the US, whatever. So, just follow along. How do you see those challenges, and where do you see the opportunities to address them?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you know from the book, in chapter one, I talk about my own sort of internal struggle with what I thought was true, and then speaking with people like Grant Gordon from Essential and Sarah Lahey from Gain, and reading Michael Kremer's report and speaking to some of the people on his commission at the University of Chicago. Um, so what I think is definitely true is that alternative proteins could follow a trajectory similar to electric vehicles, where it's the wealthier countries that are the early adopters, because it's easier to develop, in the case of EVs, the charging infrastructure, the cost of conventional cars is higher. And so the cost of EVs, they become competitive at a higher cost, et cetera. And then as the cost continues to fall, then they start to penetrate in developing economies. And we saw that. I mean, almost from 2016 to 2025, like 98, 99% of EV penetration, even as EVs went from basically 0 to 24, 25% globally. It was developing economies plus China. Developed economies plus China for EVs. And I think Brazil and India were still like less than 1% as of 2025 EV adoption. That is what I have been assuming would be the case for plant-based meat and cultivated meat. And that kind of also aligns with the, rich countries need to eat less, poor countries need to eat more, diet change focus, except this is, in the alternative proteins context. It is also true, though, if you look at India as one example, and there's a little bit of there's a global south and there's kind of another global south. But I think if you look at India or you look at Brazil, the possibility that India or Brazil could fill the role for alternative proteins that China has filled for electric vehicles and renewable energy, I think is extremely appealing, especially in India with the level of malnutrition, which is largely protein and micronutrient deficiency rather than caloric deficiency. And it would also, Prime Minister Modi's number one goal in life is that India is a developed economy by 2047, trying to attract foreign direct investment. This could, be the proverbial sort of multiple really positive outcomes from the country leaning in on the technology, high quality protein, helping to solve malnutrition, et cetera. But you look at, looking at what Grant Gordon is doing at Essential, looking at some of the work that One Africa Fund has done, the plant proteins are still less expensive than animal proteins. And the peer review research does indicate that the plant protein outcomes, are oftentimes from a alleviating malnutrition standpoint, equal to the animal protein outcomes, but you can get a lot more, you can produce a lot more plant protein with the same amount of money relative to animal protein. So I do think alternative proteins can be a significant part of the sort of direct intervention solution, in addition to a more long-term solution as prices come down sufficiently. And then the last thing to say is, especially in India, which produces 60-65%, I think, of generic vaccines. Like they have an incredibly advanced um, technical capacity, scientific and engineering ecosystem, et cetera. I do think India could also be a significant producer, innovator, and supplier on the cultivated meat side, and not just the plant-based protein side.
It's very interesting what you say about India. I did interview Modi back when he was the chief minister of
Wow.
Gujarat, and it was on a climate change related story, and he did specifically say that India was not going to put the brakes on its development. The West has had
Of course.
centuries of developing without having to worry about pollution related breaks or environmentally related breaks, and that there was no way that India was going to put the brakes on.
And you
And he,
can't really begrudge him that, I don't
oh
think.
no, I don't. I think
Yeah.
there's that goes back to what I said before about in some ways it can be the arrogant Western
Yep.
colonial attitude that still does persist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's right on the alternative protein side as well. It absolutely can't be you need to do this, you need to sacrifice for the good of the world. Like it can't be that. But I do think there are strong self-interested reasons that the global South might find these technologies appealing as well.
And then some of those, obviously, all there's many different cultures and
Yeah,
societies and religions, etc. So, just because it's coming from India doesn't mean it's going to be seen as awesome if it's rather than coming from the US or Europe or elsewhere. So
yeah, of
there's
course.
those that doesn't alleviate it, just changes the lenses. One quick thing that is not actually food related, but it relates to land use, and that's the ethanol production for vehicles. And I know I remember this was probably 10, 15 years ago now. I remember speaking to a person who looked at that, and the actual energy increase or the carbon, the climate footprint benefit of that by the time you took into account the growing of the crops, the inefficiencies of fermentation, the fertilizer, and all those things and the climate footprints, you were only getting a less than 10% energy increase. So, and it takes up huge amounts of land. So, whilst it's not food, where do you see that in the big picture?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on ethanol at all, but I do have a tremendous amount of respect for Tim Searchinger from the World Resources Institute. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Mike Grunwald, who wrote "We Are Eating the Earth," and I think he did a really, really nice job with that book. And both of them, their heads come very close to exploding when they're talking about ethanol production. I think they both argue, and again with the caveat that I haven't examined what the other side is, but it sure seems like ethanol is a huge net negative for climate, not just a net negative, but a huge net negative for climate. And I still remember, Jean Ziegler saying that biofuels are a crime against humanity, all the way back in I think 2006, 2007. He was the global envoy on food to the United Nations at the time. And he pointed out that 100 million metric tons of cereals are diverted to fuel, and as a result, prices are going up and people are starving. I mean, that seems to me to be almost certainly true. And the more we're diverting crops to fuel, the worse that problem is getting. Complete with the observation, I think, from people like Searchinger and Grunwald and WRI and others, that it doesn't even have climate benefits, especially because of the land use needs. It's sort of negative for climate. So that's what I believe to be true. It's not an official GFI position. It's not something we work on, but it does feel to me like something that warrants more work and more concern than it seems to be getting.
I think it comes back to the all of the above space
Yeah.
where you can what we need is change and progress on all of the above. We're almost at time. So before we go, Bruce, is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
I mean, a self-interested plug for the book. So if you want to learn more about the book, meetbook.org is where you can find it. MEAT, obviously, book.org. If you want to see some of the reviews and endorsements, meetbook.org/praise. But yeah, really nice support from people like Kim Stanley Robinson and Christiana Figueres, and Jane Goodall and others who I think your listeners probably think a lot of.
Bruce, thank you very much for joining me today.
Really, my pleasure, Ash. I'm grateful to you for the labor of love that is your podcast. It's really a beautiful thing to be doing and a gift to the world. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Ash Cloud. Please subscribe to Ash Cloud if you've enjoyed this podcast, where I will continue to discuss food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental, political, and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them.